zu rüsten zum nächsten Appell. Und wieder werden die Menschen kommen und gehen und stets aufs Neue ergriffen, beglückt und begeistert sein. Denn die Idee und die Bewegung sind Lebensausdruck unseres Volkes und damit ein Symbol des Ewigen. Es lebe die nationalsozialistische Bewegung. Es lebe Deutschland!
It is a mistake to think that the national revolution is only political and economic. It is, above all, cultural. We stand in the first stormy phase of revolution, but already it has uncovered long-hidden sources of German folkways, has opened paths to that new consciousness, the awareness that all the expressions of life spring from a specific blood, a specific people, a specific race. Out of this most profound consciousness shall the new structure of German culture arise. And from this it must follow that art is not detached, but must be rooted profoundly in the German people and in the heroic attitude of its soul. In March of 1933, Christian Mergenthaler, the director of the Militant League for German Culture in the city of Stuttgart, gave voice to one of the guiding visions of the new Nazi regime. The German race, he argued, brought low by a dilution of its racial vigor, could only reach its fullest potential if the enemy within was exterminated. If anyone should ask, he continued, what is left of freedom, he will be answered, there is no freedom for those who would weaken and destroy German art. There must be no remorse and no sentimentality in uprooting and crushing what was destroying our vitals. Mergenthaler's speech was not unique for the content of its ideas. It is easy to forget that the Nazis had few original ideas of their own. Most could be traced back to social Darwinist theories about the rise and fall of human races, common among intellectuals and politicians living in every other Western state. The Nazis, however, were unique among these states in presiding over the only Western industrial empire to have been stripped of its overseas colonial territories and business holdings, a consequence of defeat in the First World War. Humiliated on the battlefield, stripped of their colonies, and made financially dependent on the victors, the Germans now knew what it felt like to be treated like an Oriental in the age of Western supremacy. Unlike the Ottomans or Chinese, however, the Germans had the technical know-how and industrial foundation required to hit back against their so-called oppressors. Their riposte on the battlefield led to World War II, but it is their riposte in the realm of culture that is most relevant to the worlds of art, antiquities, and archaeological expeditions. The Nazis pursued the ideal of the nation-state to its most logical and grotesque conclusions. Unrestrained by a cosmopolitan vision of a global empire, the Nazis scapegoated their most visible internal other, the Jews, for the failure of the German race and nation to achieve its full potential. In the world of art, this translated into a designation of degenerate art for any painting that either depicted Jews or was produced by a Jew. Throughout the 1930s, it became common for such degenerate works of art to be seized by Nazi authorities and placed for sale on the international auction circuit. Jewish art was not the only category deemed degenerate, however. Also included was much of what passed for modernist and realist art. Modernist art, with its abstract reflections on contemporary life in non-linear form, was criticized as nonsense or the work of crazy men intent on insulting the people and isolating art from the nation. Conversely, realist art, if it portrayed the common man and woman in an unflattering light, was charged with draining the morale of the German people. In 1937, Adolf Ziegler, a German painter tasked by Hitler with purging the nation of degenerate art, gave voice to this sentiment when he declared that, quote, "He who paints our youth as wasted idiots, and the German mother like a Neanderthal woman, has shown undeniable proof of his degenerate character." But it was not enough simply to eliminate the enemy within. Once cleansed of the Jewish parasite, the German race must still reconnect with its own forgotten roots. These roots were imagined to be synonymous with what was referred to as the ancient Aryan race. Originally a linguistic term coined to invoke similarities between classical languages such as Sanskrit and Latin, the root word of Arya increasingly came to be used by scholars throughout Europe as a convenient shorthand for an Indo-European race whose ancestors were credited with the very birth of civilization itself. In short, every accomplishment of humankind was chalked up to an Aryan ancestor of some sort, with less impressive achievements attributed to the degeneration brought about by mixing with an inferior race. In 1935, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, founded a scholarly organization dedicated to research into the origins of the Aryan race, the Ahnenerbe, meaning something inherited from the forefathers. Its agenda was clear: to recover the lost wisdom and achievements of the Germanic branch of the Aryan race as inspiration for the revitalization of the German nation. From 1935 to 1939, Himmler bankrolled expeditions to 4 remote sites outside of Germany in hopes of extolling the ancient wisdom and glories of what he referred to as the Nordic Aryans. In 1936, the first group of scholars was sent to a rural farming village in southwestern Sweden, which boasted thousands of rock art engravings from the Bronze Age. Just 1 month later, another expedition was sent to a remote site in eastern Finland, said to be home to witches and shamans in possession of ancient Scandinavian folklore. In 1937, the Ahnenerbe financed the work of scholars in northern Italy and the Balkans, who promised to study prehistoric rock inscriptions that proved the founding of ancient Rome by the Nordic Aryans. Perhaps the most ambitious undertaking of the Ahnenerbe, however, was the expedition to Tibet in 1938. Led by Ernst Schaefer, a zoologist and naturalist who had traveled widely throughout China and Inner Asia, the purpose of this mission was to uncover evidence of ancient Aryan migrations in the remotest parts of Asia. En route to Lhasa, they dangled the prospect of free medical services as an enticement to local populations to submit to anthropometric measurements of their skulls and facial features, on the belief that such data could prove or disprove the presence of Aryan blood. The Nazi pursuit of racial purity was expressed in both political and scholarly terms. Among the Nazi targets for extermination, the Jews were most frequently singled out. In the process, the Nazis inadvertently laid the groundwork for a Jewish political awakening and inspired renewed efforts to create an independent homeland for the Jewish people. One of the more colorful figures in this awakening was Zosha Tchaikovsky, a Jewish refugee and later soldier whose turbulent career as an amateur historian would span both sides of the Atlantic. Tchaikovsky was born in 1911 into a poor Jewish family in east-central Poland. Unable to afford a formal education, Tchaikovsky instead followed his brothers to Paris when he was 16 years old. There, he found work as a journalist and came under the wing of Elias and Rebecca Cherikauer. In 1925, the Cherikauers had helped to create the Yiddish Scientific Institute, or YIVO, an organization dedicated to the study of Jewish life in Eastern and Central Europe. As a Polish Jew, Tchaikovsky naturally gravitated toward YIVO, writing articles and gathering research materials for the Cherikauers. When the war broke out in 1939, Tchaikovsky put down his pen and volunteered for the French army, in part to prove his loyalty to his adopted state, and in part to escape possible anti-Semitic backlash. Just 1 year into the war, a bullet through the shoulder and lungs led to Tchaikovsky's discharge from the French army. Hoping to avoid his deportation to an internment camp, the Cherikauers managed to secure an American visa for Tchaikovsky on the pretext that he was a Jewish intellectual worth saving. Incredibly, after his arrival in the United States, Tchaikovsky again volunteered for military service, receiving training as a paratrooper. On June 5, 1944, just 24 hours before D-Day, he jumped out of a plane over German-occupied Normandy and exchanged fire with German troops on the ground. Over the next year, often working as a translator for Allied forces in Europe, he would see firsthand the destruction wrought by the Nazi occupation of France and Germany. Of course, Tchaikovsky had long experienced the effects of anti-Semitism in Europe. What he saw in his post-war patrols through Paris and Berlin would galvanize him in ways that peacetime discrimination had not. He learned, for instance, that the wartime puppet government of Vichy France had facilitated the deportation of 76,000 Jews to Nazi death camps. Untold numbers of Jews had suffered the loss of property and possessions through government-sanctioned confiscations, with little to no compensation after the war. As for the Jews themselves, Tchaikovsky was distressed to learn that the horrors of the war had done nothing to unite them against a common enemy. In Paris, he deplored the sights of Jews, quote, doing nothing to put damaged Jewish life in Paris back together. On the contrary, he said, they continued to talk about world problems, about everything in the world except Jewish problems. How could Tchaikovsky, a refugee paratrooper who had once worked as a journalist, succeed in uniting the Jewish people? The answer? By rearranging the organizational building blocks of history itself. During the final years of the war, as Tchaikovsky followed U.S. armies into Berlin, he found that he could enter abandoned government offices with impunity and remove any documents that related to the lives of Jews in Europe. In Tchaikovsky's mind, the unconscionable treatment of European Jewry over the past decade meant that the continent had forfeited any right to pose as a defender of the Jewish people. Now, the only safe repository for any sort of Jewish materials was abroad. With his military superiors turning a willfully blind eye to his activities, Tchaikovsky got to work, rummaging through Nazi archives and storage rooms for any materials related to the lives and livelihoods of Jews in Europe. Before long, box after box of such materials were mailed to EVO offices in New York, courtesy of the U.S. Military Postal Service. Once the war ended, Tchaikovsky found it harder and harder to quit old habits. From 1945 to 1961, Tchaikovsky stole tens of thousands of documents from French municipal archives. When he was caught red-handed in Strasbourg, he fled France and began stealing from institutions closer to home, in this case, the New York Public Library. In his published works, the Jews were a coherent race and nation wherever he found them, shorn of their individual national contexts. Before any given Tchaikovsky theft, the files on Jews were arranged as part of the larger fabric of France or Germany, interspersed among different government departments as they would be for any French or German citizen. After a Tchaikovsky theft, however, these same files would be rearranged and sold to new scholarly archives as a specifically Jewish collection of sources, shorn of the larger French or German context of their daily lives. In the realm of science and scholarship, we might think of Himmler's Achnenerbe as the action and Tchaikovsky's archival thefts as the reaction. The Nazis said that all Jews were the same, one coherent, filthy nation that needed to be exterminated. Tchaikovsky wanted Jews everywhere to agree with the first part of this statement, while putting a positive spin on the second part. The Jews were certainly one coherent nation, but it was a glorious nation worthy of the pride of each of its far-flung members, and his scholarship strove to reflect that agenda right up until the day he was caught stealing from the New York Public Library. On September 26, 1978, with nowhere else to run, Tchaikovsky committed suicide in the bathtub of a Manhattan hotel. World War II had proven to be the ultimate battleground for the politicization of science, archaeology, and history. With the end of the war, these battles would enter new frontiers undreamt of by previous generations. Please join us next time as we explore the Space Age in the 21st and final episode of Indiana Jones in History.
Und wieder werden die Menschen kommen und gehen und stets aufs Neue ergriffen, beglückt und begeistert sein. Denn die Idee und die Bewegung sind Lebensausdruck unseres Volkes und damit ein Symbol des Ewigen. Es lebe die nationalsozialistische Bewegung, es lebe Deutschland!